Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on the Constitution as a system of constraints and compromises. The core question is this: how do delegates build a stronger republic without rebuilding the concentrated power they had just fought to escape? The core competency is to articulate the major debates and compromises that resulted in a workable national constitution. How do delegates build a stronger republic without rebuilding the concentrated power they had just fought to escape? When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787, they did not walk into a room full of men who already agreed on what a stronger republic should look like. They arrived from states with different sizes, economies, debt burdens, and political cultures. Some feared legislative turbulence in the states more than they feared national overreach. Others still treated centralized authority as the chief danger because the memory of imperial power remained fresh. The Confederation Congress had exposed fiscal weakness, but the cure remained disputed. The Philadelphia Convention therefore began as a design crisis. The delegates had to decide where authority should reside, how representation should work, whether the executive should be singular or plural, how judges should be appointed, and how the whole system might act with enough energy to govern without reproducing monarchy. Secrecy shaped the work from the start. The convention met behind closed doors in the Pennsylvania State House, later called Independence Hall, with windows shut for privacy. That setting changed events because delegates wanted freedom to change positions without immediate public pressure from newspapers, legislatures, and creditors. They also knew that many state instructions mentioned revision of the articles, not full replacement. A closed room gave them the space to move beyond those instructions. George Washington presided, lending prestige and calm. James Madison arrived with extensive preparation notes and a theory that the Confederation had failed because it acted on states rather than directly on individuals. That distinction framed much of the debate to come. A government that reaches only state governments must wait for state cooperation. A government that can legislate, tax, and regulate directly reaches the citizen through its own institutions. The first major design challenge came through competing plans. Edmund Randolph of Virginia presented the Virginia Plan, drafted mainly by Madison. It proposed a stronger national government with 3 branches, a legislature of 2 houses, and representation weighted by population or contribution. Large states favored that logic because population would convert size into influence. The legislature under this scheme would choose the executive and judiciary, and the national government would have broader authority over legislation affecting general interests. Small states quickly saw the danger. If representation tracked population in both houses, states such as Delaware or New Jersey could be outvoted regularly by Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. William Patterson answered with the New Jersey Plan. That proposal kept a single-house legislature with equal state representation while granting Congress some additional powers, including the ability to levy duties and regulate commerce. The debate was not abstract. It asked whether the Union would remain a compact of states or become a national republic where individuals counted more directly than state equality. Other structural issues followed immediately. How long should representatives serve? Short House terms might keep members close to public sentiment, but make long planning difficult. Longer Senate terms might provide stability, but also distance senators from immediate voters. How should the executive be selected? A direct national vote posed practical and political difficulties in a large republic with uneven information and communication. Selection by Congress risked dependence. Selection by state executives or electors opened other problems. The judiciary raised another set of questions. Should judges merely interpret laws, or should they also help review state or national acts? The convention did not move through these issues with one guiding formula. It moved by confronting different fears in sequence and trying to convert them into institutional arrangements. The delegates under the greatest pressure were those who had to protect local interests without wrecking the Union. Madison pressed for government capable of acting directly on citizens and restraining state turbulence. He believed repeated local majorities in the states had endangered property and stable governance. His answer was a larger republic with filtered representation. Roger Sherman of Connecticut approached the problem differently. He accepted the need for a stronger national framework, but understood that smaller states would not consent to a system that erased their equality. His role in compromise became central because survival of the convention depended on convincing both large and small states that they had not entered a trap. The Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, emerged from that pressure. The House of Representatives would be apportioned by population, while the Senate would give each state equal representation. Revenue bills would originate in the House, nodding toward popular representation, but the Senate would hold major legislative power through equal votes. That arrangement was not a neat philosophical synthesis. It was a political settlement built to keep the convention together. It embedded two principles that do not fully fit together. People counted directly in one chamber, states counted equally in the other. The Constitution would carry both logics forward. Executive design produced similar bargaining. Delegates wanted energy and administration because the Confederation lacked it. They also feared monarchy. The result was a single president with limited term length, a veto subject to override, command of the military, appointment power shared with the Senate, and responsibility to execute the laws rather than make them. The Electoral College later became the chosen method of selection, though that arrangement involved its own compromise logic and appears more fully in the related lecture on embedded bargains. The key point here is that the office did not arise from confidence in one man. It arose from the belief that legislation alone could not run a republic. The judiciary also took shape through cautious strengthening. Article 3 would establish a Supreme Court and allow Congress to create inferior courts. Federal judges would hold office during good behavior, giving them protection from immediate political retaliation. That changed the structure because a national government that could legislate and tax also needed a forum to interpret disputes over treaties, commerce, and constitutional power. Delegates did not settle every detail in Philadelphia. Much of the court system would come later through statute. Still, the convention accepted that the new government required a more durable judicial core than the articles had provided. Ratification politics hovered over all of this. Delegates knew the document had to survive state conventions. Federalists would defend the Constitution in public essays and speeches. Anti-Federalists would attack the plan as too centralized, too distant from local control, and too light on explicit protections for individual liberties. That future battle influenced choices in Philadelphia even before the public campaign began. The Constitution itself shows the design tension in its structure. Article 1 begins by vesting legislative power in Congress, but it immediately divides Congress into House and Senate. Article 2 vests executive power in a president, yet surrounds that office with term limits, impeachment vulnerability, and shared appointment and treaty procedures. Article 3 creates a judiciary, but the lower federal courts remain dependent on congressional creation. Each article grants power and then channels it. Short quotations reveal the pattern. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. The first clause gives Congress authority, but the second clause slows that authority by requiring bicameral agreement. Article 2 then states that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. Delegates chose singular energy, yet they avoided a hereditary executive and limited the office through elections, fixed terms, and the possibility of removal through impeachment. Article 3 begins, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The language creates judicial permanence and legislative dependence at once. This is why the Constitution should be read as a working system rather than a set of inspirational statements. The source does not promise government by one pure principle. It distributes power across branches and chambers because the framers did not trust any one side of authority. The people act through representation rather than one simple channel. States retain influence without confederation supremacy. The executive gains energy while remaining bounded. Courts receive authority whose reach depends in part on later legislation. The document turns fear into structure. Convention procedure reinforced that design. Delegates referred unresolved issues to committees, reconsidered earlier votes, and translated broad agreements into tighter draft language through the Committee of Detail and later the Committee of Style. The famous wording of the Constitution came after weeks of committee work, cross-checking, and revision. That detail is decisive because the document was built clause by clause. Vesting language, impeachment procedure, qualifications, and legislative channels passed through repeated editing rather than one dramatic vote. The consequence of the Philadelphia design was not immediate unanimity. The Constitution left the closed room and entered one of the most intense public arguments in early American history. Federalists such as Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay defended the new frame in newspaper essays later collected as the Federalist. They argued that the larger republic could control faction better than small republics because interests would be numerous and no one group could easily dominate. Anti-Federalists such as Patrick Henry, George Mason, and many local critics countered that the proposed government would overshadow the states, tax too broadly, maintain a standing army, and govern from a distance dangerous to liberty, Ratification conventions in the states became the next arena of institutional judgment. Delaware ratified quickly. Pennsylvania did the same after sharp conflict. Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York required harder persuasion and promises. One of the most important promises involved a Bill of Rights. The Constitution, as drafted in 1787, created a stronger frame of government, but did not yet list explicit protections such as freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, protection against unreasonable searches, or jury rights in the form later Americans would know. Anti-Federalist pressure on that point was strong enough that Federalists accepted future amendments as the political price of ratification. The geography of ratification shaped the defense of the frame. In Virginia, Madison had to answer Patrick Henry and George Mason before a convention whose approval affected the legitimacy of the whole Union. In New York, Hamilton and Jay fought uphill against strong anti-Federalist sentiment, while commerce-minded citizens weighed the risks of standing outside the new system. In Massachusetts, political leaders moved toward assent only with recommended amendments attached. The Constitution survived because structural arguments and practical coalition building worked together. Different offices also ran on different clocks. House members faced election every 2 years. Senators served 6-year terms. Presidents served 4-year terms. Federal judges held office during good behavior. The framers assigned these different timescales deliberately because they wanted public energy, state stability, executive continuity, and judicial endurance to check one another instead of moving at one shared pace. The unresolved judgment is not whether the convention solved every problem. It did not. The unresolved question is what kind of republic had to be built for union to survive. The delegates responded to the failures of the Confederation by creating a stronger national frame. They responded to fear of concentrated power by dividing that frame internally. They responded to state inequality by splitting representation between chambers. They responded to legislative excess by creating executive and judicial checks. The Constitution, therefore, emerged as a system of constraints and channels, not a direct pipeline of public will. It strengthened the republic by slowing it, dividing it, and forcing institutions to bargain before power could move. Even the signing in September 1787 reflected careful staging. 39 delegates signed, a few refused, including George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry. The document left Philadelphia with prestige, dissent, and unfinished argument already attached to it. The Constitution left Philadelphia with energy, prestige, and dissent already attached to it. The harder judgment is whether the stronger frame preserved Republican survival at a reasonable price, or whether some of its compromises transferred danger forward instead of solving it. The signatures launched a government without ending that argument.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.